The station smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. It always had. Admiral Sarah Voss had spent 31 years breathing it, and she had long stopped noticing. What she noticed now was the document on her screen, 3 pages, standard format, the consortium's golden sunburst emblem at the top, printed in ink that cost more than a Terran engineer made in a month. She read it twice, then she signed it. The protest was filed at 6 o'clock station time, the same as the last one, the same as the 14 before that. The consortium would receive it, stamp it, drop it into a database somewhere in the bureaucratic belly of their capital station, and forget it existed. This was diplomacy as the galaxy understood it. A performance everyone attended, and no one believed in. Voss set the stylus down. Outside the viewport, Earth turned blue and white, slow and indifferent, the way it had always turned. She had grown up watching it from this station. Her son had watched it too. For the 8 years she had kept him up here before the Kepler posting, before the reassignment, before she looked away from the viewport. Her aide, Lieutenant Renmako, stood at the door, young, sharp, the kind of face that had not yet learned how to hide what it was thinking. He was thinking she looked tired. She was tired. They have confirmed the patrol route. She said, "Yes, Admiral." 3 Velhari dreadnoughts. They crossed the pale boundary at 0430. No intent filing with Terran Authority. No communication at all. Of course not. She stood. Her knees did not hurt the way they used to. The station's medical bay had done something about that last year. Something she had not asked questions about because she had not wanted to hear the answers. She was 54. The station was 54. They were the same age. She and this piece of floating metal. And some days she thought they were equally tired of holding themselves together. Where are they headed? Projected course puts them over the Mirror colony by 0400. Mirror. 50,000 people. Farmers mostly. Biodome agriculture supplying food to 3 other colony systems. The colony had been there for 60 years, built by people who had scraped together what the consortium would allow them to have. No FTL drives, no exotic energy systems, nothing that might make a human colony feel too permanent, too real, too much like a civilization, and not enough like a holding pattern. Velhari dreadnoughts passing over Mira at low orbit was not an accident. Nothing the consortium did was an accident. It was a message. The same message it always sent. We are here. We are large. Sign the treaty. The treaty in question was a resource extraction agreement. Consortium mining corporations wanted access to 3 asteroid belts in the outer Terran system. The UN Terran Authority had been stalling for 8 months, raising objections, requesting amendments. Playing the game as well as any species 300 years behind the galactic curve could manage. The dreadnoughts were the consortium clearing its throat. Voss walked to the tactical display and looked at the patrol route. 3 red markers moved in slow formation across the projected map. Vast, unhurried, the way things moved when they did not believe anything could touch them. She studied the route for a long moment. "Get me Ganymede Station on the secure channel," she said. Mako's face did the careful thing it did when he was choosing his words. "Which channel, Admiral?" "You know which one." He left without another word. He was learning. It had taken him 2 years to stop looking surprised when she said things like that, but he had gotten there. Voss looked at the patrol route again. The Velhari had catalogued everything they could see. That was their way. Thorough, careful, centuries of intelligence work done on the quarantined human species. They knew the Terran Defense Fleet, ship counts, armament assessments, energy signatures, propulsion ratings. They had filed it all and rated humanity's military capacity as negligible at their whole thickness. Chemical propellants, fission reactors, nothing exotic, nothing worth fearing. They were not wrong about what they had seen. They just had not seen everything. The secure channel opened, static first, then the clean audio of a properly shielded line. The voice that came through belonged to Director Hollis Crane, 70 years old, sounded like gravel in a tin can. Had never in his life delivered news in an excited tone. He delivered all news flat and precise, the way a man reads a parts list. At Mural, Director status 87 arrays at full charge, 41 operational, 46 on reserve cycle. Ganymede primary lance is at 98.4%. The colony arrays are all green. We have been green for 11 days. 11 days. She had not slept well in 11 days. And the Mirror Ridge installation came online 6 weeks ahead of schedule. The pause. Something that might have been pride from a different kind of man. Your daughter-in-law's engineering team. Voss said nothing for a moment. Her daughter-in-law Lena, who had kept the name Voss after everything, who had raised the grandchildren. Voss saw twice a year on video calls because the posting allowed nothing more. Who had poured her grief into blueprints and tunnel surveys and decades of quiet, patient work in sealed underground facilities that appeared on no consortium map. Lena had never once said the word Kepler to her. She did not need to. It was in every rivet. Tell me the lances are ready, Voss said. Not a question. It had not been a question for 3 years. Not since the last simulation. Not since the numbers had come back clean. She said it because it was the ritual of it. The way soldiers check weapons, not because they doubt them, but because the checking is itself a kind of faith. They are ready, Admiral. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Thank you, Director. She closed the channel. Outside, the Velhari dreadnoughts continued their slow arc toward Mirror Colony. Voss watched the red markers crawl across the display, the galaxy's most powerful military machines, moving like they owned the space they moved through. Because for 211 years they had. She thought about the pale, the boundary line the consortium had drawn politely with all the careful diplomatic language of a civilization that considered itself kind, a protected developing species. That was what the charter said. Humanity had been classified, catalogued, and placed behind a line for its own good. The way you put a fence around something fragile or dangerous. They had never been quite sure which one they thought humans were. Voss had read the consortium's original quarantine documentation declassified 30 years ago, and the uncertainty was right there in the language. Unpredictable behavioral patterns accelerated technological development relative to psychological maturity. Recommend containment pending further study. Containment pending further study. 60,000 people had died at Kepler Colony because the consortium had decided a blockade was the cleanest way to enforce a trade restriction. No weapons fired, just ships in the way. Stopping food convoys, stopping medicine transports, stopping the supply runs that kept a colony alive. 6 months a lesson, the Velhari High Arbiter had called it in the official report afterward, a necessary demonstration of the limits of unilateral human action. 60,000 people, a lesson. Voss picked up the signed protest document, 3 pages, standard format, the right words arranged in the right, useless order. She set it back down. Her grandfather had been an engineer. Before him, the family line went back through ordinary work, ordinary hands, ordinary lives. None of them had been soldiers, but her grandfather had been the first to write down the thought experiment on the back of a supply invoice in a machine shop that smelled like oil and metal just because he ran out of proper paper. And the idea would not wait. Just physics, just a question. What happened if you accelerated a dense object to a fraction of light speed using electromagnetic force? No exotic fuel, no consortium technology, just current and rails and the fundamental laws of the universe which belonged to everyone and could not be quarantined. The math was simple. It had always been simple. That was the thing no one outside the pale seemed to understand about humans. They had not invented the physics. The physics was always there, available to any species patient enough to work through it. Humans had been angry enough to do it in a cage. Mako reappeared at the door. The Velhari patrol has made contact with Mirror Colony's traffic control. They have declared a standard navigation survey approach. Navigation survey? Voss almost smiled. Of course. Is there anything I should prepare for, Admiral? Mako asked. He was being careful with the words. She looked at him for a moment. 23 years old. His mother was a hydroponics farmer on the Vega station. His father taught secondary school mathematics on the same station. He had joined the fleet because he believed in it, in what it stood for. She had believed in it once, too. She still did, just differently. Yes, she said. Prepare a formal protest document, unauthorized boundary crossing, failure to file route intent. Make it thorough and correct. The pause. And after that, open a channel to Mirror Colony's Ridge Operations Center. He understood. She could see him understand. He was young, but he was not slow. Yes, Admiral, he said and left. Voss turned back to the viewport. Earth turned below her, the same as always, blue and patient. She had read once that human beings had stared at the stars for 100,000 years before they reached them. Standing in fields and on rooftops and on the sides of dark mountains, looking at points of light and understanding without words that the universe was enormous, and they were small. They had never once decided that was a reason to stop. The consortium had read that history and seen a warning. Voss had always read it as a promise. The secure channel to Mirror Colony's Ridge Operations Center opened a minute later. The voice that answered was Lena's. Steady and low, carrying something underneath it that Voss recognized, not because she had the same thing, but because she had been the one who gave it to her. Grief converted, shaped into something that could hold a purpose. Sarah, Lena said. Lena, a pause that held more than a pause had any right to hold. How are the arrays aligned and green? We have been running final diagnostics since 0500. And your team? The beat. Ready. Voss looked at the dreadnoughts on her display at Mirror Colony below them on the map. 50,000 people living their lives, growing food, teaching children, watching the same sky humans had always watched. Good, she said. She did not say anything else. Neither did Lena. They did not need to. Two women connected by a loss that had no bottom. Standing at the edge of something 200 years in the making. And all the words that mattered now were technical ones. Angles and velocities and electromagnetic tolerances. Everything else had already been understood at Kepler. Or rather, it had never needed to be said out loud. It had been carried, passed between people who kept it sharp deliberately because something that sharp made you careful, and careful made you accurate. Stand by, Voss said. Standing by, Lena answered. The dreadnoughts reached Mirror Colony's outer orbit and settled into position. Vast and certain. Certain in the way that only things which have never been challenged can be certain. Voss thought about the pale, the boundary, and the way it had been drawn, with diplomatic language that said humanity was fragile, dangerous, and contained. But something had changed. The cage had become irrelevant. The math had changed. Humans had developed in the dark, and they had built something that could speak a language the consortium could not argue with. They just didn't know it yet. Voss watched the red markers on her display. Voss sat at her desk, staring at the display. The Velhari dreadnoughts were still on their projected course, crossing the pale boundary, marking their dominance in this part of space. The colony beneath them, Mira, had no way to defend itself. The Terran Authority was small, fractured, and constantly forced into political games, trying to make their voices heard, but no one was listening. The protest they had filed, signed, and sealed would meet the same fate as all the others: ignored, forgotten, archived. They played their part as they always did, but the result was always the same. She sighed and glanced out the viewport at the blue marble of Earth far below. She had seen it 1,000 times, but today it felt different. Today, the weight of the decision she had made yesterday was still pressing down on her. She had authorized the firing of kinetic mass drivers. She had taken action. A small step, a demonstration of force, but one that could change everything. The consortium had built a system based on rules that never took humanity into account, rules that presumed humans would always be small and weak. And for 211 years, they had played along. They had played the game of diplomacy, filing protests, negotiating, begging for just a bit of recognition. The Velhari dreadnoughts were a reminder of what they had come to believe about humanity. They were an intimidation tactic, a show of strength meant to remind the Terran Authority who held the power in this galaxy. But now, for the first time, Voss felt like humanity was no longer playing by their rules. Admiral, Mako's voice snapped her out of her reverie. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The formal protest is ready for submission. We've also received a response from the Velhari Patrol. They acknowledge receipt of the protest and plan to proceed with their navigation survey, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Of course they do. It's what they always do, Voss muttered, standing up. She walked to the display, her fingers hovering over the interface. "What's the status of the dreadnoughts?" she asked. "Same as before. They're maintaining their course and speed. No change in their path. They're not acting like they're worried about anything," Mako replied, glancing at the map on the screen. "They're not," she said quietly, looking at the red markers slowly moving across the map. "But they should be. They just don't know it yet." She didn't need to explain further. Mako could read the resolve in her face. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. She wasn't going to let the consortium push humanity around any longer. It had been too long. Too many people had died. Too many opportunities had been wasted. Voss had learned, over the years, that sometimes diplomacy wasn't about playing by the rules. It was about changing the rules entirely. Mako hesitated, then spoke again. "Do you think they'll respond to this one, Admiral?" Voss turned and looked at him. He was young, eager, still filled with idealism. She could see it in the way he looked at her. He was waiting for her to say something that would assure him that everything would be fine. But Voss knew better. "They'll respond, all right," she said, her voice steady, "but not the way we want. And we're not going to get what we want through words anymore." She turned back to the viewport, staring at the stars beyond. The Velhari dreadnoughts were far away now, but they would reach their destination soon. Mira was a small colony, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But Voss had been there. She had seen how hard the people of Mira worked to survive, to create something real, something that wasn't just a placeholder in the vastness of the universe. And now, that fragile existence was being threatened, not by a force they could fight, but by the weight of the bureaucracy that kept them in check. "They won't listen to us through diplomacy," Voss continued. "They don't care about our protests or our pleas. But they will listen to this." Mako didn't ask any more questions. He had learned, as all good officers did, when to stay silent and let the Admiral do her thinking. Voss felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, but she didn't waver. She had spent too many years playing by the rules. Now it was time to change the game. Time to show the consortium exactly what humanity was capable of. The math had always been there, available to anyone patient enough to figure it out. The consortium had simply assumed humanity wouldn't figure it out fast enough. They had assumed the Terran Authority was just a collection of weak, helpless colonies. But they hadn't accounted for the human spirit. They hadn't accounted for the drive to survive, to build, to adapt. Humanity wasn't small and weak. It was resourceful. And it had been building in the dark, quietly, for over 2 centuries. "The Velhari don't see us as a threat," Voss said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "But they should. They just don't know it yet." She turned back to Mako, her expression hardening. "Prepare a message. Make it clear. Make it loud. And make sure the consortium hears it." Mako didn't hesitate. "Yes, Admiral. Right away." As he left the room, Voss stared once more at the red markers on the display. The Velhari dreadnoughts would never know what hit them. Because humanity wasn't small. It wasn't weak. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike back. And that moment was now. The next phase would be a demonstration. A loud, unmistakable statement. The consortium would finally realize that they had underestimated humanity. And when that realization hit, it would be too late. The game was changing. Voss stood by the viewport, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the slowly retreating figures of the Velhari dreadnoughts as they moved farther away from the pale boundary. The red markers were distant now, almost invisible against the stars. But they were still there, and that meant something. The station hummed around her, a quiet, constant reminder of the world they lived in. She'd spent her life inside the station, surrounded by the mechanical heartbeat of a vast system, always the observer, never the one to make the first move. Until now. Now, she felt the shift deep in her bones. Something had changed in the universe. The consortium had kept humanity contained within this thin line, this pale, for over 2 centuries. But now, that cage was about to be shattered. The plan had been set in motion. The message was clear. The protest would be filed, processed, archived, and ignored. That was how it always went. The same bureaucratic cycle. But Voss knew it wasn't about the protest anymore. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about showing the consortium the truth they had ignored for so long. Humanity wasn't what they thought it was. And they had built something in the dark that no one had seen coming. Mako returned to the room, looking every bit the young officer who had just begun to understand the gravity of the decisions they were making. "Admiral," he said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of tension, "we've filed the protest as ordered. It's already in the consortium system. The fleet is on standby. We're ready for your next move." Voss nodded without turning from the viewport. She didn't need to see him to know that he was still unsure. He was still expecting answers, still hoping for a clean, easy resolution. But there was no easy answer anymore. They had crossed a line. There was no going back. The consortium would never take humanity seriously until it was too late. And it had always been this way. Humanity had always been underestimated. That was their strength. Voss spoke softly but with purpose. "Tell the fleet to hold steady. We wait, but not passively. This time, we show them what they've been ignoring." She turned to face him then, her expression as unwavering as the stars. "This isn't about the next move, Lieutenant. It's about sending a message that they will never forget. We have nothing left to lose." Mako met her gaze, his face hardening as the weight of her words settled over him. She could see the shift in him now. He was no longer just the eager officer following orders. He was starting to understand that there was no such thing as diplomacy anymore, not with the consortium. It was a game of power, and humanity was finally about to play. "Yes, Admiral," he replied, voice low, but full of newfound resolve. "I'll relay the orders." He left again, and Voss turned back to the viewport. Her mind raced through the possibilities. The dreadnoughts were withdrawing, but the real message wouldn't come from just the protest document. It wouldn't come from the threat of diplomacy, or even from the formal declaration of intent. It would come from the way the universe itself had just shifted, the way that the physics, the raw, unyielding math, had spoken louder than any treaty or agreement. Her grandfather's thought experiment, the idea he had jotted down on the back of a supply invoice in a metal-smelling shop, had been the spark. It had always been the spark. Humans had never invented the physics. They had just figured it out when no one was watching. They had built it in secret, in the dark, where no one cared to look. Now it was about to be unveiled. They weren't just playing the game anymore. They were about to rewrite the rules. The communications system chimed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from the secure channel from Ganymede Station. She opened the communication and listened to the calm, steady voice of Director Crane. "Admiral, the fleet is in position. The Ganymede Lance is ready to deploy on your command. We are prepared to initiate the demonstration as discussed." Voss paused for a moment. The next move was hers. She could hear the sounds of the station around her, the hum of machinery, the faint sound of officers moving in the hallways. It felt almost surreal, the weight of everything hanging in the balance. The consortium had underestimated them. They had always thought of humans as a primitive species, one that lacked the capacity for grand ambition. But humanity had always been capable of more than just survival. They had the drive to adapt, to evolve, to push the boundaries of what others considered impossible. And now, the consortium would be forced to see just how wrong they had been. "Execute the plan, Director," she said, her voice calm, but the determination behind it clear. "Send the message. Let them know that we are no longer the ones confined." The secure channel clicked off, and Voss stood still, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the station. The dreadnoughts, the mighty Velhari fleet, were still retreating. But now, the true force of humanity's resolve would be felt across the galaxy. It wasn't just about the next protest. It wasn't just about filing the next set of documents. It was about the shift in the balance of power. It was about sending a message so loud and clear that the consortium could no longer ignore humanity. It was time to show them what they had failed to see. The window for change had opened. It was time to act. The hum of the station seemed to deepen, vibrating through the bones of everyone who stood in its confines. Voss had spent decades in space, surrounded by the cold indifference of the stars. But now, the air around her felt charged with anticipation. The protocol had been set, the protest filed, and the fleet positioned. All that was left was to wait for the consortium's response, and for the rest of the galaxy to realize what humanity was capable of. She stared at the tactical display, watching the slow, deliberate movements of the Velhari dreadnoughts. The red markers moved along their path, their trajectory unchanged, seemingly unaware that the next stage of the game was already set in motion. It wasn't about diplomacy anymore. It was about demonstrating something the consortium had never been forced to reckon with: humanity's ability to act. Not just with words, but with force. Not with military might, but with a different kind of power, one that the consortium had overlooked. She had read the protest documents, signed the bureaucratic agreements, and filed the endless reports. For years, it had all felt like playing a game of survival, playing by rules that didn't seem to take humanity seriously. But now, they were playing a different game. They were no longer waiting for permission to move. They were moving on their own terms. "Admiral," Mako's voice broke her reverie once again, but this time, it was different. There was something in his tone, something that didn't sound like uncertainty or fear. It was something else. She turned toward him, expecting the usual updates. But when she met his gaze, she saw something that made her pause. "It's done," he said. "The message is out. Ganymede's system is live. The fleet is holding steady." His words hung in the air, charged with the weight of what they had just set into motion. For a moment, Voss said nothing. She simply nodded, as though the action itself had been inevitable. She'd known from the beginning that this moment would come. The only question had been when, and now, it had arrived. She turned back to the viewport, staring at the stars as though she could feel the vastness of space pressing in on her. The pale boundary, that invisible line that had kept humanity caged for so long, felt smaller now. It was still there, still marking the edge of the known human territories, but it no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like the last relic of a system that was no longer in control. Humanity had been working in the dark for centuries, building something the consortium hadn't even known to look for. And now, humanity was finally going to make it known. "They'll try to ignore it," Voss said, more to herself than to Mako. "They'll try to label it as an isolated incident, a mistake, a misstep. But they won't be able to. Not now." Mako nodded, the weight of their actions clear in his eyes. He understood now. He hadn't been with her long enough to see it, but this was the turning point. The moment where everything humanity had quietly built in the shadows would no longer be ignored. "I've seen the reports from the fleet," he said, his voice steady. "The Velhari are withdrawing faster now. Their course is changing. They're not responding to the protest, they're responding to something else." Voss smiled grimly. "They're responding to the reality that the math has changed." The dreadnoughts were retreating, but they were retreating with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. The Velhari had never taken humanity seriously. They had seen them as a primitive species, unworthy of true consideration. But they were beginning to see that humanity had capabilities far beyond what they had anticipated. The protest was just the beginning. The real message was in the change of trajectory, the fear that now lingered in the air, even if they refused to acknowledge it. "Get me the secure channel," she ordered. Her voice was sharp, unwavering. She had been through enough moments like this to know that hesitation could cost them everything. Mako moved swiftly, connecting her to the secure line. Director Crane's gravelly voice came through almost immediately. "Admiral Voss, the fleet is ready. The Ganymede lance is locked and loaded. We're prepared to take the next step." Voss didn't need to ask any questions. She knew the plan. It was simple, direct. A demonstration. One shot, fired with precision and force. A kinetic mass driver fired from inside the pale boundary, aimed at a target just beyond the edge, but close enough to make a statement. "Director, initiate the demonstration. Now." Her voice was clear, firm. The time for hesitation had passed. "Understood, Admiral." Firing in 3, there was a brief pause, and then the countdown began. The channel went quiet, and the next few seconds stretched out in silence. Voss stood still, her eyes fixed on the display in front of her. She had prepared for this moment for years, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. It felt like something she had always known would happen, but never truly believed would. Then the first shot was fired. The display flickered as the kinetic rod shot through space, moving at speeds that no human sensor system could have predicted. It was a blur of motion, nothing but a streak of mass cutting through the fabric of space. And then, as it crossed the pale boundary, it hit. The dreadnoughts, still far away, still retreating, flinched. The physics of the shot didn't care about the politics, the treaties, or the power structures of the consortium. It didn't care about anything except the laws of nature. The rod passed through the empty space before them, so fast and precise that it left no room for doubt. Target acquired. Impact successful, Mako reported, his voice calm, but the tension in it was palpable. Voss didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, watching the stars stretch out before her, knowing the consortium was now fully aware that humanity was no longer a species they could dismiss. They had just sent a message, loud and clear. And now, the next phase of the game would begin. The calm of the station felt alien after the tense moments of the demonstration. The shot had been fired, but now came the waiting. The calm was deceptive. It was the kind of silence that only came after something monumental had happened, something that could not be undone, no matter how much the galaxy tried to bury it. Voss walked back to her desk, the noise of the station around her seeming to grow more distant, as if the space itself was holding its breath. She didn't need to look at the display to know what was happening. The consortium's response would be swift, but it would be calculated. The Velhari had made their move, and now they were waiting for humanity to blink. The dreadnoughts had retreated for now, but the real test was yet to come. Would they understand? Or would they push forward, underestimating the message once again? Admiral, Mako's voice crackled through the calm, breaking the silence. His tone was different this time, serious, urgent. We've got incoming transmission from the Velhari. High priority, marked as urgent. Voss didn't flinch. She'd been expecting this. The Velhari had no reason to keep their response private any longer. What had been a casual, dismissive withdrawal would now take on a new form. They had to decide how to respond to the shift in the galaxy's balance of power. Put it through, Voss ordered, her voice steady, betraying no sign of the weight she felt pressing on her chest. She had sent the message, and now it was time to face what came next. The screen flickered to life, and the face of High Arbiter Thesaven Kale appeared on the display. His expression was unreadable as always. The Velhari had centuries of practice masking their thoughts, but the faint twitch in his brow told her that something was different this time. Admiral Voss. Kale's voice was as calm as ever, but there was an edge to it that she hadn't heard before. We've received your demonstration. It was impressive. Voss didn't respond immediately. She wasn't here to exchange pleasantries. This was a moment for action. We didn't do this for your approval, High Arbiter, she said, her voice cold but resolute. We did this to show you something you've ignored for far too long. There was a brief pause before Kale spoke again, his voice even more measured than before. You've sent a message, that much is clear. However, I need to remind you, Admiral, that a single demonstration, however impressive, does not change the terms of the Pale Compact. Voss's lips tightened. She had expected this response. They had underestimated humanity for centuries, and now they were trying to paint this moment as an isolated incident. But this wasn't just one shot, one protest, one demonstration. This was the culmination of 200 years of work. Humanity had built something in the dark, and now it was in plain sight. The consortium would never be able to ignore it again. I'm not here to change the terms of the Pale Compact, High Arbiter, Voss replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. I'm here to show you that the cage you built to contain us is no longer enough to keep us inside. You've underestimated us for too long. Kale's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of history, of decisions made in the dark, of actions that had led them to this point. Finally, Kale spoke again, his voice carrying a hint of something she had never heard before, doubt. What is it you want, Admiral? If this is a threat, you've made your point. But if it is a declaration, we need to understand what it means. Voss's fingers clenched around the armrests of her chair. She wasn't about to back down now. The consortium had spent 211 years holding humanity in check, and they were finally about to realize the truth. The truth that they had never really understood humanity's capacity for resilience, for persistence, for adaptation. This wasn't a threat. This was the beginning of something bigger. "We want full membership in the consortium," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We want a seat at the table, not as a subjugated species, but as equals. We want the Pale Compact dissolved. No more borders. No more restrictions. We will no longer accept being treated as second-class citizens in a galaxy that refuses to see what we're capable of." For the first time, Kale's expression shifted. It was subtle, but Voss saw it, the flicker of realization. They had underestimated humanity. They had made the mistake of thinking humanity was just a young species, a primitive species, incapable of challenging the established order. But now, humanity was challenging them, and the universe was about to find out what that meant. "I've spent 200 years holding this system together, Admiral," Kale said, his voice low, as if speaking to himself. "I've believed that containment was necessary. But what you've shown today, it changes the equation." Voss knew that this was the turning point. She could hear it in his voice, the hesitation, the doubt creeping in where certainty had once reigned. The consortium was no longer in control. Humanity had done something they hadn't expected. It wasn't just the demonstration. It was the fact that humanity had spent 2 centuries building something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. "We built it in the dark," Voss said softly, almost to herself, "because you kept us there. You assumed we would stay there. But the math was always there. We just needed time to figure it out." Kale didn't answer right away. Voss could hear the wheels turning in his mind, processing the enormity of what was unfolding. Humanity was no longer confined by the Pale. They had broken free of the boundaries that had held them in place, and they were demanding something more. "Very well, Admiral," Kale said after a long silence. "We will begin a review of the Pale Compact. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but we will begin discussions. Expect a formal reply in the coming weeks." Voss nodded, though she knew the reply would be nothing more than a formality. The consortium was already changing its stance. The uncertainty, the fear, had already started to seep in. They knew what was coming, and they had no way to stop it. "Make sure that reply is clear, High Arbiter," she said, her tone firm. "This time, we're not waiting for permission. We're not waiting for your approval. We've taken the first step. The rest of the galaxy will follow." Kale was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, it was with the same cold precision that had defined him for centuries. "We will see how your people respond to the changes, Admiral. And we will make our own calculations." Voss smiled, but it was a smile without humor. "Make your calculations, High Arbiter. But don't take too long. We're not waiting anymore." The transmission cut off, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the station systems. Voss stood from her chair, looking out at the stars again. This was just the beginning. The Velhari, the consortium, they thought they had humanity contained. They thought they had it figured out. But humanity had been building something in secret for 200 years, and now that secret was out. They would never see the universe the same way again. And neither would the Velhari. The time of waiting was over. The station was quiet again, the tension that had been lingering in the air now palpable in every corner. Voss stood by the viewport, staring at the stars as if they might give her an answer. She had known the moment would come, but even now, with everything set into motion, the weight of it was still a sharp edge against her chest. The Velhari had been forced to take a hard look at humanity, forced to understand something they had overlooked for centuries. The universe had changed, and they were just beginning to realize it. Mako stood at his post, watching her carefully, still learning the silent ways she carried herself in these moments. She could feel his eyes on her but didn't turn to face him. There was no need. She could feel the shifting energy in the room, the same energy that had been building for years. It had been a slow burn, a patient work of laying the groundwork, and now it was all coming to a head. There was no going back. "Admiral, I've just received word from Ganymede," Mako said, his voice breaking through the stillness. "The consortium is moving forward with the review. They've acknowledged the need for an emergency session, but they're not offering any specifics yet. They're taking it slow. Voss didn't flinch. She had expected this. Of course, they were taking it slow. They had been for 211 years. But now, the pace would have to change. Let them take all the time they need, she said softly. The longer they delay, the more they'll be forced to confront what they've ignored. The math is already in front of them. They can't pretend they don't see it now. Mako paused, his eyes flicking over to the tactical display. The red markers representing the Velhari dreadnoughts were still there, still retreating, but now there was something different in the way they moved. It wasn't just a calm, calculated exit. It was a retreat with purpose, a shift in trajectory. The Velhari were running their calculations, just as the Terran fleet was. They'll react soon, Mako continued, his voice low. They'll have to. And when they do, we need to be ready. I don't think they'll just roll over. Not with everything that's happened. Voss nodded, her gaze never leaving the display. The Velhari didn't have a choice now. Their options were limited. They had underestimated humanity, and now they had to confront the truth of it. That truth would be impossible to ignore. They won't roll over, Lieutenant, Voss said, her voice colder than before. They'll fight to keep control. But they're not prepared for what's coming next. Not yet. Not until we force them to. There was a sharpness in her voice now, a conviction that had been building ever since the shot had been fired. It wasn't just about the protest, the treaty, or the demonstration anymore. It was about proving humanity's place in the galaxy. The consortium had spent 2 centuries shaping the narrative, controlling the flow of information, setting the boundaries of what humanity could do. But that narrative had cracked. Humanity had pushed beyond the limits they had been given, and now it was time to show the galaxy what that really meant. Prepare the fleet, Voss said after a long pause, her eyes narrowing as the dreadnoughts continued to drift away. We've done our part. Now we wait for them to make their move. But we need to be ready to act the moment they decide they have no other choice but to fight back. Mako straightened. Understood, Admiral. I'll relay the orders immediately. He moved quickly to his station, but Voss didn't follow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, that there was something they hadn't accounted for yet. They had made their move, but the Velhari had not yet fully revealed their response. The waiting felt like it was dragging on, but she knew the real danger was coming when they made their next move. They would test humanity. It would be a challenge. And Voss would be ready for it. Her thoughts drifted back to Kepler. The memory was like a wound that had never truly healed. 60,000 people. She hadn't forgotten them. She never would. But it wasn't just Kepler that pushed her forward now. It wasn't just the dead that drove her to take this action. It was the future of humanity, and the future that the Velhari had tried so hard to suppress. That future was here now, and the galaxy would see it whether they liked it or not. The consortium had underestimated humanity's resilience. They had underestimated the force that drove them to build, to create, to adapt when the universe didn't care. But now, humanity had built something they hadn't accounted for. It wasn't just a weapon. It wasn't just a ship or a fleet or a strategy. It was something more fundamental. It was a message. And that message was about to change everything. The silence that filled the station now felt heavier than it had before, but Voss knew it was the silence before the storm. The Velhari would respond, and when they did, they would face something they weren't prepared for. Because no one, no empire, no alien species, no force in the galaxy, could hold humanity back when it had decided to fight for its place in the stars. Her fingers brushed over the protest document on her desk again, the one that had started this chain of events. It was still just a piece of paper, filed away with all the others, buried in bureaucracy. But it wasn't just about the words on the page. It was about what came next. And what came next was the reckoning. Outside, the stars glittered coldly in the blackness of space. They were indifferent to the battle humanity was about to wage, indifferent to the sacrifices that had already been made. But for Voss, the universe had always been indifferent. It didn't care. It was up to humanity to change it. It was up to them to shape their own destiny. Admiral, Mako's voice again, sharp this time. Incoming transmission from Ganymede. They want a direct line with you. Voss nodded. Patch it through. The screen flickered, and the face of Director Crane appeared once more. His expression was serious now, no trace of the flat neutrality he had maintained before. The weight of the situation had shifted. The consortium was no longer pretending they didn't see it. Now, they had to decide what to do with what humanity had shown them. "Admiral," Crane said, his voice tense, "we've received word from the Velhari. They're not taking this lightly. The review is officially underway, but they've made it clear they'll want to discuss terms in person." Voss's lips curved into a tight smile. "Let them come," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "We're ready." The display went silent again, and Voss turned back to the viewport, her gaze steady. The storm was coming, and humanity would be ready when it did. The tension was building, palpable, as the station drifted in the stillness of space. Voss stood by the viewport again, but this time, there was something different about the way she looked at the stars. The calmness that had previously seemed almost oppressive now felt like the calm before a battle. And humanity had already shown its hand. There was no turning back. Her mind was sharp, focusing on the calculations, the political fallout, the risks of their actions. Everything was moving faster than she had expected, but the momentum was something humanity had earned. After centuries of restraint, of compliance with the Pale Compact, they had broken free. There was no one to stop them now. Mako approached her quietly, his steps almost soundless. He knew better than to interrupt her in these moments. She had the kind of focus that didn't just demand silence. It commanded it. The hum of the station's systems, the quiet murmur of voices behind her, all faded into nothing as she considered the coming confrontation. "They've confirmed the meeting," Mako said, breaking the silence. "The Velhari High Command wants to meet face to face. They'll arrive in the next 24 hours. Official representatives. No more games." Voss didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had expected this. She knew the next steps as clearly as she knew the beat of her own heart. But the stakes had just escalated. A meeting with the Velhari meant more than diplomacy, it meant everything. It was the chance to set the record straight, to finally end the cycle of containment that had kept humanity in check for centuries. It would be a battle of wills, not of weapons. Words would be their weapons, and Voss was ready to wield them. "Prepare the room," Voss said simply. "Get everything in place. Let them see the truth of our position. This isn't just about negotiations anymore. This is the moment where the galaxy will finally know what humanity is capable of." Mako nodded, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the shift in him. 2 years ago, he might have been nervous, uncertain. But now, he was growing into something more. He had begun to understand that humanity's place in the galaxy wasn't something that could be dictated by others. They had carved their own future, and now the rest of the universe would have to acknowledge it. The room was being prepared. Voss didn't need to give orders for everything to fall into place. The right people knew what to do. She was surrounded by professionals, by people who had spent years working toward this moment. Everyone understood their role, their place. They had come to this point together, and now, in this meeting, they would solidify humanity's position in the stars. The tension on the station grew. The members of the Terran delegation were already assembling, waiting for the final step. This was the final phase of the game, and no one was going to back down. The Velhari had underestimated humanity for too long, and now the reckoning was upon them. Voss knew that no matter what happened in the meeting, the outcome had already been decided in the hearts and minds of every human who had ever lived under the Pale Compact. The doors to the meeting room opened, and the representatives of the Velhari High Command entered. They were imposing, their presence filling the room with an undeniable gravity. Their towering figures, their stern faces, they represented centuries of domination, of power. But Voss didn't flinch. She didn't let their size or their status affect her. She had a job to do. The High Arbiter, Kale, was the last to enter. His age was evident in his slow movements, but there was still a sharpness to his gaze that was impossible to miss. He had seen everything in his 340 years of life, and Voss knew he would be trying to calculate every move she made, every word she spoke. But that was his mistake. He was still thinking in the old ways, the ways that had kept humanity under control for so long. He hadn't realized that the game had changed. The math had shifted. "Admiral Voss," Kale said, his voice low and steady as always. "It is clear that things have changed." Voss met his gaze without hesitation. "You could say that. It's more than clear. It's undeniable." He nodded slowly, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. He wasn't sure how to proceed, and she knew it. The Velhari had spent centuries drawing lines, keeping humanity in check. But now, humanity had drawn its own line, and it was one the Velhari couldn't ignore. "We've reviewed the situation," Kale said, his voice cold but laced with something else, something that wasn't quite apprehension but close. "Your protest, your demonstration. It's unusual. It's unprecedented. But you should understand that nothing has changed in terms of the Pale Compact. Our position remains the same. We will not allow you to." "Not allow us to what?" Voss interrupted, her tone sharp, cutting through the flow of his words. "What's left for you to control, High Arbiter? You've already seen the demonstration. You've already seen what humanity is capable of. The Pale Compact is no longer something we're willing to accept. Not under your terms. Not when we've spent 200 years proving we can do more." The room was silent, and Voss could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a declaration. The Consortium had pushed humanity to the edge for far too long. Now, humanity was pushing back. The Velhari had spent too long ignoring the signs, too long assuming that humans were incapable of reaching the stars on their own terms. Kale shifted slightly, his face unreadable, but there was a subtle change in his demeanor. He had expected to come into this room and dictate the terms, to reinforce the power dynamic that had kept the Velhari in control for so long. Instead, he was met with someone who refused to back down. Someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Someone who wasn't afraid to confront him. "I'm not here to argue the Pale Compact, High Arbiter," Voss continued, her voice steady. "I'm here to tell you that humanity is done asking for permission. We're done being held back. We're done waiting for your approval. The treaty you want to sign is not going to be enough anymore. It's time for us to stand as equals." Kale's expression remained unchanged, but Voss saw the flicker of something in his eyes. It was a mixture of surprise and, perhaps, something darker. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected humanity to have the courage, the audacity, to demand a place at the table. But now, there was no going back. "We'll see about that," Kale said, his voice low. "But you've made your point, Admiral. The Pale Compact has always been about balance. But now, it's a different equation." Voss didn't respond immediately. She knew the equation had changed. It wasn't about diplomacy anymore. It was about power, about asserting humanity's place in the galaxy. And the Consortium wasn't ready for what humanity had become. "You'll have to learn to adjust," Voss said quietly. "Because this time, we're not going to wait for you to change. We're going to change the rules ourselves." The room was still. The Velhari representatives exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to what had just happened. The galaxy was shifting, and humanity was leading the charge. Outside, the stars continued their slow, indifferent dance across the heavens. But for the first time in centuries, humanity wasn't standing still. Humanity was moving forward, faster than anyone had predicted. And the Velhari would have to decide if they were going to keep up. The meeting had ended, but the silence in the room lingered long after the representatives of the Velhari High Command had departed. Voss could feel the weight of the moment in every fiber of her being. It wasn't just the shock of what had been said, it was the quiet realization that everything they had done up to this point had led to this single point of confrontation. The galaxy would never be the same again, not after today. The Terran delegation remained in the room, a few officers still shifting around, gathering their documents, making their notes. Mako stood off to the side, his eyes fixed on the now-closed door where Kale and his delegation had exited. There was a thoughtful expression on his face, one that Voss knew well. He was processing it all, the implications, the stakes, the shifts in the political tectonics that had just happened. "Admiral," Mako's voice was soft, almost reverent. "Do you think they truly understand?" I mean, what we just did. Voss took a long breath, turning away from the viewport to look at the room that was still charged with the aftershocks of the confrontation. No, not yet. They won't understand it until the consequences hit them square in the face. They've been living inside their bubble for so long, they don't see the cracks. But they will. She wasn't just speaking to Mako, though. She was speaking to herself. She needed to believe it, needed to believe that this was the turning point. For centuries, humanity had been a prisoner to the Pale Compact. The Velhari had assumed that they could control humanity's growth, restrict its potential, keep it locked within the boundaries of a carefully constructed system. But today, the veil had been lifted. Today, humanity had made its move. And now it was time to wait. Mako shifted, his eyes flicking nervously to the tactical displays still flickering on the wall. What if they strike first, Admiral? I mean, after what just happened, it's hard to think they'll let it slide. They might come at us with everything they've got. Voss met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. They can try. But they won't. They've already shown their hand. The moment they make a move, they lose the advantage. We've set the terms now. We control the pace. There was a deep confidence in her voice that even she hadn't expected. It wasn't arrogance, though, it was cold, hard calculation. Everything had been calculated, and now it was time for the Velhari to react. They would either choose diplomacy, or they would be forced into a war they weren't prepared to fight. Either way, humanity would remain standing. Prepare the fleet, she ordered, her voice sharp. If they want to escalate, we'll meet them on our terms. We're not waiting for their next move anymore. We're taking control of this. Mako hesitated for a moment but nodded quickly, heading toward the communication console. As he worked, Voss allowed herself a moment of reflection. It wasn't about the immediate threat anymore. It wasn't about showing strength through power. It was about something deeper, about proving to the galaxy that humanity was more than just the sum of its parts. That, despite everything the Consortium and the Velhari had done to keep them in check, humanity had not only survived but had thrived. And now, it was time to take what had always been theirs by right, their place in the stars. Admiral, the fleet is ready. Mako's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned toward him, her gaze hardening with purpose. The next phase was in motion. Humanity had been tested and found wanting by the galaxy's standards. But humanity would prove them wrong. They would not be weak. They would not be compliant. They would stand their ground. She turned to face the viewport once more, watching the stars stretch across the blackness of space. It was cold, indifferent, and vast. But this time, humanity had a say in the direction it moved. The Velhari had spent 211 years thinking they controlled the narrative, that they could keep the human race contained. But humanity had never been contained. And now it was time to rewrite the story. One battle, one negotiation at a time. The galaxy would watch. And it would remember who had written its future. Voss felt the pull of the inevitable. It wasn't the first time she had been in this position. But now, for the first time in her career, she knew the path ahead would not be dictated by the Consortium's rules. They would have to rewrite their own script. And humanity would be at the center of it. Let them come, Voss murmured under her breath, her voice steady, carrying the weight of everything they had already endured. We'll show them what happens when you push us too far. The first step had been taken. The galaxy was watching, waiting for the next move. And humanity would make sure it was the one that defined the future. No one else would decide it for them. The next day came faster than Voss had anticipated. Despite the quiet tension that had filled the station the night before, everything seemed to be moving according to the plan. Humanity had drawn its line, and now the universe had to decide what to do with it. The Velhari's response had been carefully calculated, diplomatic, formal, and expected, but that didn't change the fact that something had shifted in the balance of power. Voss sat at the center of the war room, a large screen projecting the status of the fleet, their positions, and the countdown ticking slowly toward the next phase. The ships were in position, ready for anything. Each crew member, each officer had their role to play, but Voss knew the reality was simple. They were ready to make a stand. Not just for survival, but for the future. She had spent her life under the shadow of the Pale Compact. And now, that shadow was gone. There was no going back. Mako entered the room, his posture still formal but now carrying a confidence that matched the weight of their mission. His eyes met hers, and without a word, he moved to his station, syncing up with the latest communication feed from Ganymede. The consortium was still playing its part, still acting like it was in control. But Voss knew better. The Velhari might think they were in charge, but they had miscalculated humanity's resolve. They had underestimated the stubbornness, the sheer will that drove humans to survive, adapt, and overcome. And now they would pay the price. The message from Ganymede came through clearly, but its implications were harder to read. The consortium's response had been swift, but it lacked the conviction it once had. There was no grand statement of power, no sweeping declaration of dominance. There was only uncertainty, a hesitation that made Voss smile. It was the first crack in their confidence. And cracks in a system as old as the Velhari Empire meant it was only a matter of time before everything started to crumble. "Admiral, the Velhari are officially requesting a secondary meeting," Mako said, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something else there, something that suggested the world as they knew it was shifting. "They've expressed concern over the current status of negotiations and the actions taken on the Pale Compact." Voss didn't react immediately. Instead, she studied the fleet status report, her eyes scanning the data with an almost detached focus. The Velhari were stalling, playing for time, perhaps trying to regain their composure. But this time, it was different. They had been forced into a corner. For 211 years, they had held the upper hand, controlling everything in the galaxy's dealings with humanity. But now, the tables had turned. "They're stalling," Voss said, her voice low but filled with a quiet certainty. "They're trying to regain control of the narrative, to make it seem like they have options. But they don't. Not anymore." Mako nodded, though he didn't quite seem convinced. "Are we ready, Admiral? I mean, really ready? If they come at us, if they push this further, we'll have to act, and we can't afford any hesitation." Voss turned to him, meeting his gaze with unyielding clarity. "We're ready. We've been ready for this. It's not about waiting for them to make their move anymore. It's about showing them that we won't back down. The moment they cross the line, we respond. No hesitation." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the officers who had gathered around the table. There was no room for doubt now. They had made the first move. The Velhari had no choice but to react. But the next move? That was humanity's choice. And Voss had no intention of backing down. "We'll respond to their request for another meeting," Voss continued, her voice unwavering. "But we'll make sure they know exactly what the stakes are. No more diplomatic games. No more empty threats. This time, they're facing humanity's resolve." The hours ticked by as they finalized their plans. The next meeting would be crucial, but Voss had a feeling it would be their final negotiation, the one where everything came to a head. The Velhari might still believe they were in charge, but this time, they would learn that humanity was done playing by their rules. The time for polite protest was over. Now, humanity was ready to claim its rightful place in the galaxy. The Pale Compact? It was nothing more than a relic of the past. A line drawn in the sand that no longer mattered. Voss had no intention of waiting for the Velhari to make their move. It was time for them to see what humanity could do when it was no longer held back. "Admiral, we've received confirmation of their terms for the meeting," Mako said, bringing her back from her thoughts. "It's a standard diplomatic session, but they want it on their flagship." "Let them have it," Voss replied with a sharp edge in her voice. "We're done with playing by their rules. Prepare the fleet for maximum readiness. We're going to show them what happens when humanity steps up and takes control. Make sure they understand this isn't just another meeting." Voss stood and turned toward the viewport again, her gaze lingering on the stars. The galaxy had always seemed so vast, so indifferent. But now, humanity was carving its place into the void, showing the universe what it was capable of. The stars had always been there, but for the first time, humanity was ready to make them its own. The meeting was set. The Velhari might have thought they still held the cards, but the game had changed. Humanity had rewritten the rules, and the universe would be forced to acknowledge it. "We're ready," Voss whispered to herself, the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on her. The galaxy would never be the same again. And humanity would make sure of it. The time had come. Voss stood on the bridge, watching the Velhari flagship approach through the viewport. It was massive, imposing, like the proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over humanity's head. The flagship's surface shimmered in the light of the distant star, its angular design more of a symbol of dominance than functionality. The Velhari always made their ships like that, sleek, massive, and calculated to inspire fear. But now, the sight of that ship only filled Voss with resolve. "Admiral, we've confirmed the Velhari ship is on approach," Mako said, his voice steady but tinged with the kind of unease that anyone would have in the face of such a colossal force. "They're expecting us to adhere to the standard diplomatic protocols, but we're not here to play by their rules anymore," Voss finished for him. She turned her attention back to the fleet status board, watching the way the human ships moved, small compared to the Velhari dreadnoughts, but there was something new in the formation. The ships were aligned like the pieces of a well-planned strategy, waiting for the right moment to strike, not with weapons, but with intent. "Admiral, the request from the Velhari High Command for the meeting is finalized." The rooms set up on their flagship as requested, Mako said again, his gaze fixed on the communication array as it came alive with the transmission from the Velhari. Voss was silent for a moment, taking it all in. The enormity of the situation was settling in. For the first time in 2 centuries, humanity wasn't at the mercy of an empire that saw them as little more than a mistake. The Velhari had underestimated humanity's capacity to survive, to evolve, and to fight back. And now, they would see just how far humanity would go to reclaim its place in the galaxy. "Their invitation is as formal as they get, Admiral," Mako added. "They expect us to follow their procedures, but it's clear, they're not prepared for what we're about to bring." Voss turned to Mako, her expression hardening with a quiet confidence. "I'm not here to negotiate, Lieutenant. I'm here to show them exactly why humanity doesn't kneel. We've been forced to play their game for too long. They think they still have control, but this meeting is where the rules change forever." A sudden buzz of incoming communication interrupted her thoughts. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Kale, the High Arbiter of the Velhari, and his message came through clear and calculated, just as it always did. "Admiral Voss, we are awaiting your arrival. Please make your preparations accordingly. We are ready for the meeting to proceed." His words dripped with formal politeness, but the underlying tension was there. Voss could sense it. The Velhari had felt the shift. They knew the balance had tipped, but they were clinging to the last vestiges of control. "We'll be there shortly," Voss replied calmly, her voice unwavering. She turned back to Mako. "Prepare the fleet for a final confirmation of the treaty terms. And make sure they understand something, they can't dictate our terms anymore." The fleet was ready. The ships were in formation, prepared for the next stage. Humanity wasn't just showing up to negotiate, they were showing up to set the course of history. Voss could feel it now, this wasn't about defense anymore. It was about offense, about forcing the galaxy to recognize the new order. Humanity would no longer be confined by borders drawn in the sand. The Pale Compact, once the cage they had been trapped in, had been shattered. Voss walked toward the command station, her steps measured, deliberate. Each movement was calculated, a reflection of the resolve that had built up in her over decades of service. She wasn't just the admiral of this station. She was the face of a new era for humanity, a bold, unapologetic force that had risen from the ashes of centuries of oppression. "We'll enter their flagship with the counterproposal," Voss said, more to herself than to anyone in the room. "And we'll make sure they know that humanity is done being passive, done asking for permission, done sitting in the back." She took a breath. She was no longer just responding to the Velhari. She was leading humanity into a future where they made their own destiny. "Get the fleet ready for final briefing," she added, her voice low but commanding. "This is the last step, Mako. We don't retreat. We don't apologize. And we don't compromise." Mako gave her a sharp nod and turned back to his station, his focus unwavering. He understood. They all did. Humanity was on the verge of something monumental, and every officer, every crew member, Every person involved understood the gravity of the situation. As the ship prepared to move into position, Voss stood at the helm, looking at the stars once more. The Velhari thought they had the upper hand. They thought that their empire, with all its power and resources, could suppress a species forever. But humanity had found a way to adapt, to survive, and now, finally, they had a chance to rewrite their story. The flagship of the Velhari moved slowly into view, its great hulking form like a shadow looming over them. But Voss wasn't intimidated. She'd seen bigger threats in her life, and none of them had ever won. This was different. This was the moment where humanity showed the galaxy who they really were. The time for silence was over. The time for diplomacy had passed. The time for humanity to step into the light had arrived. "Let's go show them," Voss murmured. "It's time to take our place." The fleet powered up, moving forward toward the Velhari flagship. The stars didn't seem so cold anymore. They didn't seem so indifferent. For the first time, humanity would stand among them as equals. And when the Velhari looked back at them, they would see the truth. The cage had been broken, and humanity was free.